Welcome to Resource on the Go, a podcast from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center on understanding, responding to, and preventing sexual abuse and assault. I'm Sally Lasky, NSVRC's Evaluation Coordinator. On this episode, our Communications Director and I talk with Rachel Martin Asproth, who is a nonprofit communications manager and anti-violence storyteller, and the former Senior Communications and Design Coordinator with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We're also joined by Maggie Royer, the Senior Communications Manager at Violence Free Minnesota. We discuss their passion and partnership about ethical media and practical strategies to change the way people talk about sexual and domestic violence. Please be mindful that there are discussions about domestic violence, suicide, and sexual assault cases and how they are discussed in the media included in this conversation. Take good care of yourselves. Welcome to Resource on the Go, everyone. This is Sally Lasky, and I'm very happy to have our Communications Director, Laura Palumbo, here for this conversation with Maggie and Rachel. Maggie and Rachel, we're so honored to have you with us today. Could you share a bit about yourselves for our listeners?
Sure. I'm Maggie, she, her. I'm the Communications Senior Manager at Violence Free Minnesota, which is the statewide domestic violence coalition. I've been working with the coalition for about 6 years now. I live in Minnesota. I'm a triplet and a social worker, and I love prevention. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I'm Rachel Martin Asproth. I am formerly the Senior Communications and Design Coordinator with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I was with them for about 5.5 years. And before that had been in the anti-violence movement for about 11 years. And I too share alongside Maggie a passion for prevention and a passion for addressing the root causes of violence, and also just a big passion for the way that we talk about violence and the storytelling that we're doing, and what are some of the ethical standards that drive that storytelling and that can be the foundation for creating change in our communities and in our society. So I've been doing that work for about 11 years. I'm currently also still doing social change work in the nonprofit sphere, in a communications role as well. So I've been telling stories a long time now, and I'm going to be continuing to tell stories. So I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome. Well, it's so wonderful to have you all with us. So NSVRC has some history working with the media and the field on how to communicate more effectively about sexual abuse, assault, and harassment. And over the years, our messaging work has looked at a few things. What different audiences do and do not understand about prevention. We've worked with journalists to help support accurate, responsible news coverage of these topics. And we work to create tools and resources to help advocates, preventionists, and others to put into practice what we've learned to shape the conversations happening in their state and community. We've been admiring your partnership around ethical media. Can you tell us how your partnership developed?
Sure. So I guess I can start a couple of years ago, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, they had developed a media guide for journalists about discussing sexual violence. And so Violence Free Minnesota had been aware of that for a while, and we'd had a couple of years of experience just really calling out on our social media these problematic headlines and content that we had been seeing in media about domestic and sexual violence. And so Rachel had reached out, I think it was maybe about 2 years ago or so now, and asked about collaborating on these social media posts so we could kind of bring like a more unified front to them. So we started doing that for quite a while. When we saw really problematic content or headlines around domestic and sexual violence in Minnesota, we would release like a joint social media post and kind of provide both of our voices and perspectives to that. And out of that, we actually had Minnesota Public Radio, which is a network across the state of Minnesota. they had noticed some of the collaborative social media posts that we were doing, and they actually reached out to us and kind of just said, hey, we've noticed these. We want to make sure that we're not replicating some of this unethical content. Would you be willing to provide a training for us? And so we did a joint training together for Minnesota Public Radio. And that was a really great experience. And then fast forward a little bit, Violence Free Minnesota ended up creating our own media guide specific to domestic violence.
Yeah, and so I would say, so several years ago, and I'm sure many of you recall this case, but the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case several years ago, I think that I would really point to that as kind of the impetus of that really pushed us into talking about this issue. So we were seeing a lot of really problematic coverage of those cases, and what we were seeing was that was echoed across so much of the coverage that we were seeing in media. So we were seeing that often, at the beginning when you would see a case come out, you might see some outrage, you might see some initial support for the victim, but that we would also often very quickly see the rhetoric change. And it would not only be in public sentiment, but really recognizing that the way that media was covering those stories and talking about those cases actually was driving the story, and it was actually driving public opinion. And so there's really a strong link between the victim blaming that we see in society and a lot of the stereotypes about violence, a lot of the harmful myths about violence, and the way that media covers these stories. And so we were really seeing that in order to really see some of the change we want to see in how society sees violence, we were recognizing, hey, we need to be talking about how media is covering violence. And so in that particular case, so we developed quite a bit of content around that case to really help provide a frame and sort of guide work for people to understand how violence really plays out. There was a lot of conversation around that case that focused on this idea of mutual abuse, that comes up really commonly in cases of violence between people who are in a relationship with each other. And so, and that was just one example of some of the rhetoric we were seeing. We were seeing a lot of misogynistic commentary on Amber Heard, and just a lot of assumptions about why she was coming forward and what her motivations were. And it also brought up some really interesting conversations about what makes somebody a victim. And this idea that somebody has to check all of these boxes in order to be a real victim, in order to be perceived and supported as a victim of violence. And so it was really a lot of just kind of swirling media coverage that essentially really portrayed this as, a misunderstanding. Well, it's complicated. It's all of these things. And we were just seeing this domino effect of how society, kind of turned on that person and wherever you kind of fall in how you engage with the coverage of this case, it's really undeniable that there was some extremely problematic coverage. There was an extreme amount of victim blaming, and there was a lot of harmful myths that we were seeing about violence. And so MNCASA developed a lot of content at the time around this case, and that really kind of pushed us into doing a lot more work around ethical media. And it was really kind of a tipping point, I think, for MNCASA as an organization of just realizing that this needs to be a really top priority in our programming and in the way that we approach the work. And then there was also just really a sense that sometimes when we talk about something, ethical media just from the perspective of sexual violence or just from the perspective of domestic violence, that we're actually really missing that a lot of the harmful media coverage relies on the same ideas about violence, the same ideas about people who experience violence, and the same ideas about people who perpetrate violence, right? And so I think that was what led us to think we really need to bring our two organizations together, because we really are stronger in this message together. We can really have a bigger impact if rather than trying to, and of course, sexual violence and domestic violence are different. They intersect, and there are so many links. The root causes of both are the same, but there are unique circumstances in domestic violence and sexual violence. But there was still a sense that in order to really have an impact and having media tell better stories about violence in general, that coming together in a partnership would really make us a lot stronger. And so I reached out to Maggie, as she said, and it really just kind of blossomed into this beautiful partnership, where over the years we would really just bring our expertise and our two unique perspectives on domestic violence and sexual violence, and really kind of knit those expertise and skill sets together in order to really offer a pretty powerful challenge, and not just a challenge to harmful media tropes and harmful coverage, but really also I think it's not just about what not to do, it's about what to do. And so that was one of the things that really drove our partnership. We wanted to do more than just say, don't do that. There's people that are doing certainly willfully harmful coverage, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding. There's also a lot of gaps in people's knowledge about violence. And so I think we really thought to ourselves, we want to also cast a vision for what could be. What would good coverage look like? What would ethical coverage look like? What would trauma-informed, survivor-centered coverage look like? And so that really blossomed into that partnership, and it led to developing trainings for media and just really a sort of system and process in place for offering these challenges, but also offering education and technical assistance and training to media.
Yeah, and I think something I would kind of add on to that is this partnership I think was so beneficial because excuse me, it allowed us to really speak to the intersections between domestic and sexual violence, which I think people really view as siloed issues. And oftentimes our fields really are siloed, but there's so much overlap between both of those issues. So every once in a while, we would make a collaborative social media post about a specific case that involved both domestic and sexual violence. And so I think for us, that was a way to kind of address some of the stigma around intimate partner sexual violence and really bring attention to a lot of these really similar dynamics. It's about power and control, and kind of address both of those issues simultaneously. So I think that was a really powerful part of our partnership.
Your partnership is really powerful. And I'm wondering, you mentioned about this work being about, changing the dialogue and infusing it with what would be less harmful messaging. So could you talk to us about what do you mean when you say ethical media? What does that look like? And Maggie, could you maybe start us off with what that concept is in your head?
Yeah, I think for me, like the real litmus test of what is ethical media when you're talking about domestic and sexual violence is if the survivor read the article that you had written about them, would they feel respected or would they feel dehumanized or victim blamed? I really kind of think about that. And I think that's something journalists should think about a lot is survivors can read your stories. Many of them will read your stories. What kind of perception or perspective are they going to glean from that story? But at the same time, I also think it's really important that a key component of ethical media is you're not dehumanizing people who use harm, because we know that people who use harm, whether it's sexual violence or they're engaging in relationship abuse, they are also often consuming this media. And the way that media is talking about these issues can really shape their understandings of their own use of harm. So if your media is reinforcing victim blaming or these problematic social norms, that can really reinforce those in that behavior within people who are using harm. But if your content is really challenging those beliefs, that can be really powerful and can really help shape that attitude change. And then something else that I would just think about, I think from our perspective, we do a lot of tracking of domestic violence homicides in the media. And so we use that information. We really rely on media coverage to put together our annual intimate partner homicide report. And so to me, ethical media, especially when you're talking about people who've lost their lives to domestic violence, a really key part of that is really memorializing and honoring and centering that victim's life and really painting victims and victim survivors as multidimensional individuals versus one-dimensional. And I think one example that I can think of from the past couple of years in Minnesota that I think was really unfortunate and really demonstrates what's unethical media is we had a murder suicide a couple years ago. And the person had shot and killed his wife and then himself. And there were many, many media articles about the murder suicide that were really, I would say, unethical. And one of the most prominent examples I can think of is there was an article that spent about 4 paragraphs detailing his life, his accomplishments, his career. And there was a very nice photo of him in a suit and tie that was kind of like front and center in the media article about this murder suicide. And the headline also did not indicate like who had killed whom. It was very nebulous. So he had these 4 paragraphs devoted to him and who he was as a person. But his wife, whom he had killed, only got 4 sentences in the article, and all 4 sentences were about her being his wife and the mother of their children, and there was no photo of her. So I think that was really unethical because we didn't get to know who she was as a person. We didn't know what her hobbies were, what she did for work, really who she was. She was really just one-dimensional. And so to me, ethical media is really about uplifting survivors and kind of really just using a lot of nuance. You're really being respectful, sensitive, and you're covering these issues with tact.
Yeah, I would echo everything that Maggie said. And, one thing I would add too is that I think when it comes to reporting on these cases, what I see, so often is that a lot of the time, and this was something really interesting that we heard when we were actually doing the training with a media organization in Minnesota, was that reporters were really concerned with what was technically correct. And so that was a really interesting difference between, what we wanted to see and what were kind of the values and practices that were common in journalism, where, they would report things that weren't necessarily untrue, but they were reported without the sense of why am I including that? What is the effect of me including that? And so I think there was a piece of, well, I've reported what is technically true, and so I don't have any accountability beyond that. Like how people interpret my words, how, society responds to what I write, that I have no role in that. I'm not, not really taking responsibility for the fact that media is a channel by which we influence people. And so the way that we report what we choose to include and what we choose to exclude from our articles is shaping people. And so what I was seeing was very much I write this article and I put it out into the world, and then I kind of set it free, and whatever happens, happens. And really seeing that media has this really kind of cyclical process to it where you cover the story, and by covering it, you are covering it from a specific social location with a specific background, a specific area of expertise and set of knowledge. So that means that you cover it with your own bias. And of course, journalists learn, in some ways how to try to address that bias, but all bias, that's a part of how we tell stories, right? We all tell stories from a specific location, with a specific background, with our own stories in mind. And so that is still going to affect how we tell the story. And then there's the cycle really of we send that kind of out into the world, and then that comes back to us, right? Like there's a circle there where actually how people hear our stories and interpret our words actually becomes societal sentiment. It becomes the practices, the ideas, the beliefs that actually then flow back into the continuation of violence, right? So it feeds the cycle of violence, actually, if we don't take care to disrupt it in having ethical practices around media. And one of the things I would say too is media really, I think, falls into often this trap of really communicating this perfect victim idea. So by the perfect victim, we mean they check every box to be able to be sympathetic, to be able to be believable. And it's really this impossible standard. And there are so many people that, for example, because of, various identities they may hold, that they already don't fit that box, right? And then there are so many other things. Well, they didn't use substances. They didn't, they don't have what you might consider like a complicated sexual history, or, maybe they are involved in sex work. Okay. So there's many things that keep someone from being the perfect victim and therefore believable and sympathetic in the eyes so often of society. And so when we choose which details are necessary and helpful to include, so often the bias really dictates what we actually put in stories. So, you might see someone's criminal history being included. For example, we know that the criminalization of survivors is really common. It might have nothing to do with what actually happened. It might have nothing to do with the story, but it actually goes to credibility. And you have to ask yourself, when it doesn't have anything to do with the story, why is it being included? And so thinking about that doesn't meet those ethical standards, right? And then we think about too, Maggie did a really good job already kind of covering this, but um, this who's being centered, I think, is really the question. So often with sexual violence, we see in cases where someone's, reputation is on the line, and you see lines about that are being kind of little details that kind of tell you like, oh, but the consequence of this would be really heavy on this person. And it really like goes to kind of not only undermining the story of the victim, but saying, is this really such a big deal? Look at the consequences. Look at the hurt that could happen if this person was held accountable, right? And we know that that person isn't being penalized. That person is actually just being, held accountable. And so I think really just a question of like, first of all, ethical media really asks who's being centered. And then, the second question too is, why are we including what we do include in the story, and really applying a critical lens to those things. I can reference a specific story. Maggie and I've talked about this a lot, but there was a case, I believe it was in Alaska, where several women were and Maggie, do you want to take this case? You remember this one.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you might remember the details a little bit better than me, but I think you know the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So it was a case in Alaska where he was a serial killer. So there was a man in Alaska who had actually specifically targeted multiple Native women in Alaska, and he would kill them and torture them. And there was an article that came out about his history of violence, and he had been apprehended at that point. But the title of the article did not mention his history of violence. You would have had no idea that this article was literally about a serial killer, because the headline actually talked about a woman's criminal history. And so the woman in the article had actually taken a memory card from him that contained video footage of some of his crimes, and she had taken it to police. So she had essentially really like came forward and helped many of these women that he had killed, and kind of bring accountability to him. But the article really focused on her criminal history, and it was totally and completely unrelated. It talked about her history with theft, her history with sex work. So it was just, that was what was really centered. And I remember reading that article and thinking, why is this included? This is an article about a man who has killed multiple women. And yet the woman in the situation, who really kind of should be positioned as like the hero, for lack of a better word, she's being positioned as a criminal. And I think, again, there was also an element of race there, because he, like I mentioned, was really targeting Alaska Native women, and he was a white man. And this is something that we see very frequently with the criminalization of survivors that Rachel talked about, is when the victim survivor is a woman of color, then if they happen to have a criminal history, for some reason, articles are suddenly including that information, but they're not doing that when the victim is a white woman. So I think that's really a question for reporters to ask themselves: is that part of ethical media? And our answer would be no.
Thank you so much for not only your background, but these examples of what it looks like for you. I don't know Laura, if you would have anything to add to this around your work with media, around talking about the fact that prevention's possible. I know there's been like there's a focus on individuals, right? And not as much around the the systems and structures that increase risk for sexual violence. And if you have anything to add around that, before I know you've got a question you want to ask Rachel and Maggie, but I thought I would just check in with you to see if you see any of this coming up with, ethics in media and talking about just this concept of prevention.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we've seen in our work with media has shown a lot of parallels to what Rachel and Maggie have been discussing, specifically when you all were talking about how um, bringing kind of bringing some of these ethical concerns to the attention of journalists. Sometimes folks are um, really receptive to wanting to cover the issue in a more informed way, and sometimes for folks, it kind of goes against their what they what has made them successful in their career, and that they think that that this is, that think more about kind of the visibility of their stories, what headline will get more traction and click-throughs. So I feel like there is always this there's always this bit of tension around some media approach their journalistic practice seeing it as a very ethics-driven role, that their job is to hold the powerful accountable, to educate communities, and then but that's not how all media see it, and sometimes there really is this focus on kind of the um, traditional values and practices um, of media, which, is things like if it bleeds, it leads, and whatever we think is more um, eye-catching, compelling, or shocking is what we should focus on. So the question that we have next for you all is how you've approached this, how you've approached your work with media. And I feel like I would be specifically interested in how have you all approached your work with media in awareness of that tension that, there are some journalists who have reached out to you all and asked, like, can you help us to cover this issue in a more informed and effective way? We want to be approaching this in a way that is constructive and helps people to see that sexual assault and domestic violence aren't just one-off situations that happen, randomly in communities, but that these are very prevalent issues, that there's a number of systemic factors that contribute to them. So, would love to hear from you both how you have approached those conversations in your work with media, times when you've kind of communicated with media directly. And then I know part of the story of this partnership is that you've also heavily used social media as a way to sort of illuminate some of um, these points.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I think very interesting and very true that you bring up that not all media, not all journalists are interested in adjusting their reporting practices. And I think that's very accurate. And not all, media respond to, very kind of well-reasoned and supported best practices with changing how they do the work, because certainly like media in many ways is also, you have folks who are, really wanting to tell that holistic, true story to, to have an impact on the world. And then you do have, certainly journalists that are more interested in sort of that clickbait and getting folks to read the article. And so it's whatever is the most grabby headline, it's whatever is the most kind of splashy, saucy take, whether or not that's responsible, whether or not that's accountable. And so I think that what you're observing is really true. And I think a little bit about, when I was at Mincasa, one of the kind of ways that we think about prevention too is really saying that there's really a spectrum, and certainly everybody can be reached by, the tenets of prevention. And we have this beautiful, vision of a world free of violence, and we believe that world is possible. But we also have, kind of a very practical sense of like that people are at kind of different places on that scale of reachability, right? Of people who are maybe very, very open to the messaging. There are people who are more in that kind of middle space of, they maybe don't know, they don't really understand a lot about it, but they're not necessarily opposed to it. And then you certainly have people who are, very much on the other end of the spectrum of, I'm not interested in this at all. I don't buy into this. This is garbage, kind of thing. And you do certainly have people that feel that way, who don't think there's a problem, who don't like, who really don't want to hear about it. They don't want to change their practices at all. So I think when it comes to sexual violence, it's really a lot of the same kind of differences that we see along the spectrum of people's, people's openness to change are the same ones that we're seeing in the media, right? Because there are also people and people that make up organizations and media outlets, who are and are not more amenable to changing their practices. And so I think one of the things that, at least from my perspective too, is having like a grand kind of progressive vision of what can be, while also having some realistic of, okay, what kind of change can we have with those people who really aren't as open, or those journalists who aren't as open to change. So I would say, sharing trainings and resources and helping those journalists and media outlets that already really want to do better, or maybe aren't certain but want to learn more. And so those are, still complicated things to approach. And, having a theory of change and creating change, as we know, it takes time. It's not easy. There are a lot of considerations. There's a lot of biases that people have, that even when they're open to your messaging, anyone who's done any kind of, sexual violence, or any kind of violence prevention training knows that, people have unconscious biases, things they don't even know they're holding. And so the same thing with media. I mentioned kind of people not being aware that they are telling that story from a very specific social location with a very specific set of experiences and a very specific background. And try as they might, none of us are able to completely shed, for lack of a better term, that kind of shell, of what our experiences are and what we bring into a space, what we bring into a story, what we bring into, learning about prevention, right? Or learning about violence. So I think part of this is also recognizing that people are bringing a lot into the space. And so you really have to be, responsive to the actual space that you're in. And I think also be realistic about what kinds of incremental changes that you can make over time and where we do have those outlets. So what I will say is, just because an outlet doesn't want to change or a journalist doesn't want to change, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be saying something, right? And so what I would really say is, Maggie and I have made it really a practice of, we certainly have what I would say some problematic journalists, some outlets that continue, despite every best practice and, resource that is available to them that we've provided to do better, continue to do the same thing over and over again. And we see that, part of this work, I think, is almost kind of a hopeful exasperation, I guess you could say, because you're hopeful and you believe in this future, right? Because we wouldn't be in the work if we didn't believe in this future, but there's an exasperation because we see repeated the same mistakes and the same harms over and over again that we could be learning from, but we choose not to, or some people choose not to, and some people choose to learn from. And so I think what I would say is that Maggie and I have really made it, through this partnership, Maggie, we've really made it a practice of continuing to call out, and call to accountability. And when I say call out, I think, I would say it's more of a calling in. It's really saying, we are going to hold you accountable. We are not going to look the other way while you cause harm to not only just to survivors, to people who experience violence, to people who've been lost from violence and their families, but also to communities and to society, and especially to vulnerable and like communities that are disproportionately impacted by society because of their identities. Um, we're not going to look the other way. And so I think continuing to have that practice of continuing to call those reporters and those media outlets in a public way, and that's hard because, you know, you worry about making enemies media as powerful, right? Like I think there's certainly a very valid fear. And I think that changes, you know, depending on which community you're in, which state that you're in. And I think those strategies certainly have to adjust depending on your context, right? We're coming at it from, you know, in Minnesota where, you know, people are, you know, certainly a little bit more open to our feedback, and not every organization feels that they're in that same position, right? And so I think acknowledging that we're coming at it from a different position, but really like it can feel like you're shouting into the void. And I think when you're saying we're still going to hold you accountable, even though it feels like you're never going to listen. But I think part of that is also using that as you're also advising your community. You're letting them know who is a trusted resource and who isn't. And that ultimately still is affecting, like when you really think about it from an economic perspective, that's affecting the bottom line of this, you know, of this media outlet. And the more people that decide, hold up, I don't trust you to cover this in a responsible and ethical and survivor-centered way, and I'm actually going to find my media elsewhere. And I think that's one of the encouragements I would say for the folks listening in is, you know, certainly when you're coming at it from a perspective of, you know, being a voice of, you know, we're not gonna you know, we're going to call that out in public spaces. We're going to talk about it. We're going to use a critical media lens, but also choosing to instead not consume that media anymore. Like, let's not give them the clicks. Let's not like, you know, let's not feed that. And eventually that hope is that enough people would be saying, this coverage isn't accurate. This coverage isn't responsible. This coverage is harmful, that this person or this reporter or this outlet actually has no choice but to adjust their practices because the community is saying no more.
That's great. And I think that it's been one of the ways that that I see the value of what you all are doing on social media is regardless of whether or not an outlet or a writer or an editor is receptive to the feedback or the guidance or the best practices you all are highlighting, you are teaching media literacy to your community, and showing folks, you know, what that can look like, and also um, um, uh, helping to dispel the idea that there isn't um, that that there isn't accurate voices or other sources that could be giving input, right? Like you're showing that like, hey, we're here, we're in the state, we're in the community, we care so much about this issue, we care about the impact it's having on our community. And we're not, you know, uh, um, we're not one of the sources that these media are readily seeking out in their stories, but we still want our voices to be heard. And I feel like that is a really powerful example for folks.
Yeah, and I would just add, just really echo what Rachel said, is that we kind of try to take the approach of like, we're not shaming you because many journalists don't know what they don't know, but we are holding you accountable. And I think also just emphasizing the importance of like a mutually beneficial relationship with the media. What do they get out of it? What do we get out of it? Like I will often say to media, we really rely on your coverage to track domestic violence homicides. And so when you're covering domestic violence homicides appropriately and with the right nuance and context, we get the information that we need for our homicide reports. And you also have readers that are more likely to trust you. Especially if there's sexual or domestic violence survivors, if they're noticing the same reporters talk about these issues with respect and sensitivity, that really can help facilitate that relationship with interviews, for example. So I think that's really helpful. And then also just like continuing to push media to ask questions to kind of get at some of the implicit biases that Rachel talked about. Like I was really thinking about this with the new Netflix show Adolescence, which kind of just blew up on Netflix, and I don't want to spoil it, but it is about an adolescent boy's exposure to misogyny online. And so I was seeing a lot of conversations about really how like flawless and masterful the show was. But I've been having conversations with my coworkers about like we still really need to interrogate this piece of media because the female characters in the show are so one dimensional. And people really respond to that with, well, that's the point of the show. But my question would be, is that the point or is that the problem? And then just also thinking about like the context of the show. Brad Pitt was one of the executive producers for the show. And so I would kind of ask if I had a conversation with the men involved in making the show, I would ask them about that choice. Like, why would you choose to have an executive producer produce this show who has a credible history of violence against his former wife and his children? Again, I don't think that's not the point of the show. To me, that's a problem. And that is kind of just, it's like a byproduct of sexism. It kind of demonstrates that we all hold these implicit biases. So even though this team of men was really invested in drawing attention to misogyny and feminism with the show Adolescence, there were still a lot of issues with it that I think really need to be interrogated. And that's kind of how we approach our work with the media.
With this multifaceted approach that you all have been using for multiple years, and in talking about your hopeful exasperation along the way, how do you stay grounded, and how do you know that your approaches are working?
I think Rachel said this earlier, but it's important to remind yourself that change can be really slow and to be patient and kind of recognize that that change we want to see is not going to happen overnight, but that doesn't mean that we should stop pushing for it. And so I think it can be really helpful to kind of like track the same journalists over time and kind of gauge to see if you can see that change over time. But I will say that we have seen some of the outlets that we've worked most closely with, they have started to include a domestic violence hotline or a sexual violence hotline at the end of their articles when they weren't doing that before, which might seem like a very small change, but it's actually really significant because, like we mentioned earlier, survivors are reading these articles. That's a good source of information and support for them. Every once in a while, we might see a headline change. Like we'll see the same reporter who used to use language like sexual relationship with when they're talking about child sexual abuse, they might say something more appropriate. And so you can kind of see those changes happening over time. And then another anecdote, we actually had an outlet reach out to us and they said, hey, we saw your media guide. We're doing the survivor or the story with the survivor. And we really want to make sure that we are sharing her story appropriately and respectfully. Can we have a phone conversation with you and talk about ways to do that? So I think that was like a really tangible outcome of our work. And then every once in a while, I've actually seen text that's like directly lifted from our media guide and it's copied and pasted into the end of some articles on domestic violence, which is really, really exciting. But again, just kind of trying to like situate myself in the reality that, like Rachel said earlier, there are some journalists and some outlets who are not invested in change. There's a lot of resistance there. And so sometimes really focusing on the outlets who they might not be reporting on the issue super appropriately, but they are really willing to learn and listen. Those are the outlets that we kind of try to spend the most time with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Honestly, echo everything that you said. Is that's really the gauge that I would say we used historically in this entire partnership is, are we seeing, are we, being consulted in more, media coverage? Are we seeing those, it was so common, even several years ago when we're seeing coverage in Minnesota. Honestly, I would say it was more rare than not to see appropriate helplines being included. So like a lot of the time we would see, one of the big criticisms that we've had is that in cases of violence, we would see a mental health line being included rather than a domestic violence or sexual violence helpline. And that really goes back to a really kind of old misunderstanding of what drives violence, and that violence is really about, somebody kind of snapping or, needing, mental health support. And that's not to say that people who cause harm are not like, may not also have mental health problems. And certainly that people who experience harm may not also need mental health support, but to say that's not what's at the root of violence. That's not the cause of violence. That's not where you're going to find appropriate support for people who may experience a really strong reaction to the article that you're writing. And so it's really important to be able to see a sexual violence hotline, a domestic violence hotline, in those pieces. And so seeing that increase and that change has been really, really great. Seeing references to the media guides, seeing media, like we've had media outlets like our coverage of like a critique or a call out around ethical media. We've seen that happen as well, where we're getting a heart from a specific media outlet on, Instagram collaboration posts that we've done that's, saying, instead of doing this, like this is really what we want to see, and this is the best practice. So, little kind of pieces like that. I completely agree with Maggie that like change is slow. We would like to be way farther along in, where we're at with ethical media than we are. But we are seeing changes, and those changes really matter. And then another kind of small thing, and this is really more like kind of qualitative observations too, but I find really rewarding too that when we, have previously published these challenges and these best practices and done collaborative posts on social media, what we've seen a lot from the community is people being like, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been so hard and painful to see this coverage, miss the nature of violence and perpetuate these harmful ideas, to blame the victim, to center the person who harmed. And just seeing that like we are meeting a need in the community too. So certainly we want to see actual concrete changes in how media approach this. But one of the other rewarding pieces I think too is where community is saying, we needed this. We need you to say this. Like, and I think that's part of like doing like, community responsive and community led work, is being like, well, certainly we recognize this is an issue and we want to see this change in the sector, but we're also saying something because our community needs us to say something. And that's part of relationship with our community. It's part of relationship with survivors, and saying, we really, as state coalitions, as organizations, across the US and territories that, are working with victim survivors of sexual and domestic violence, or in dual organizations, we are, a collective voice, and we need to be, listening to the best experts, which are the people who experience violence, victim survivors, telling us, thank you for saying this. Please keep speaking out. Please keep telling media outlets what good coverage looks like, because it hurts. It hurts every time a victim survivor reads something that isn't responsible coverage, that isn't trauma informed or survivor centered. And that reaction and that pain, I mean, that matters. And I think continuing to be this voice and speaking out about it says, this matters. This is no small thing. What even one survivor experiences in reading a harmful media article is no small thing. It's a big thing. So I would use that as a metric as well, to know that we are doing the right thing, and we are seeing impact. We are seeing success because our community is saying, thank you for speaking out on this.
Yeah, I would just kind of add briefly that I really appreciate you raising that about the community, Rachel, because it reminds me of a comment that we got on one of our collaborative posts. And this person commented on the post and said, now that you have pointed this out, I see it everywhere. And I'm going to email this journalist and these journalists, and I'm going to ask them to do better. And we've seen that happen quite a few times with multiple community members saying, now I'm reaching out to my journalist and I'm saying, hey, this is a problem. Can you change this? So I think like we didn't really think about that initially in that way because we were so focused on reaching journalists, but that really is an outcome of it as well, is like we're really mobilizing the community to also help shape that change.
That is so powerful. Thank you. That's exactly why we wanted to talk with you all today.
So, should I keep going with the questions, Sally? I don't, or because since we're at 12, or do we maybe want to jump to the resource highlights?
Yeah, I think we could jump there if everyone's okay with that, since you've talked about challenges along the way.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, I'll just give a little pause and then I will ask you that question. We are all about resources here at the NSVRC. So, as we close our conversation today, we wanted to ask if you could share your favorite resources, whether it be a person, a place, a thing, a resource that inspires your work.
I am a big fan of the Marshall Project, which is an investigative outlet that really focuses on the criminal legal system. And I really appreciate that they seem to do a pretty good job of trying to really center the voices of people who are currently or formerly incarcerated. And they've also done a couple of really kind of in depth pieces where they look at the criminalization of domestic violence survivors. So I really appreciate their coverage. And then other outlets, like I really like some of the investigative journalism that ProPublica has done on domestic violence. The 19th News has also done really good coverage on domestic violence. And then Mother Jones, they've been doing some really good coverage, particularly recently, about funding cuts to domestic and sexual violence programs and how that's impacting programs and survivors. So I really appreciate those national outlets. And then I kind of just wanted to shout out to someone who's actually based in Minnesota. Her name is Celicia Stanton, and she does a podcast called Truer Crime. And so she looks at these specific cases that are kind of like well known in true crime media, but she looks at them with a more critical lens. So she adds like more nuance and more context, and she really examines issues of race and sexual and domestic violence. So she's really kind of like trying to explore these true crime cases, but in a less exploitative way. So I really appreciate her podcast.
Well, Maggie, I know what I'm going to be listening to on my commute to the office tomorrow. Thank you. How about you, Rachel?
Yeah, those are all like amazing examples. So I won't add too much more, but one organization that I would say, I just follow and I think, they have some really helpful toolkits is Survived and Punished. I think that's a really, really useful place to look when you really want to dive in because media plays such a role in the criminalization of survivors. And I think often we think about systems as being more not thinking about media as a system, so thinking about the criminal legal system is really what is the primary kind of role of criminalizing survivors, but media has a really powerful role in that. And so I think that's an organization that I really like to follow and kind of support. Survived and Punished is a really great resource and really allows you to kind of track what's happening in a lot of these cases where this is happening. So yeah, that's a really, really helpful one. And then I would just say too, there's some really helpful. So, this is more of a kind of broader media conversation rather than just news media, but there are also some really helpful, and I'm blanking on the tools right now, and I'll have to grab this and send it along later. But there are tools specifically designed to kind of help flag media that contains violence in it and help you kind of like be able to predict that so it's not just kind of coming up on you in the moment and you're caught off guard by it. And so that can be a really helpful tool. But I think that's also a really useful tool for parents too, so that they can prepare for these kinds of conversations and, from a prevention lens, really be having them from a young age. So I always really like to rely on those tools when I'm engaging with a new, whether it's a new TV show or a movie or whatever it is. I find it really helpful to look so I know what to expect when I'm, going into it and I'm not going to be caught off guard by their treatment of violence. And so I think those can be really useful tools as well.
Thank you. Well, Laura and Maggie and Rachel, thank you for your leadership around this work. I am a continual student of all of yours, and I hope the rest of your day is more hopeful and less exasperated. And we really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and being on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Resource on the Go. Please check out the show notes for links to resources at nsvrc.org/podcasts. You can also get in touch with us by emailing resources at nsvrc-respecttogether.org.